sank under its sand. The wind blew down the valley, picking up dust and straws, and grew stronger and harsher as it went south. It stopped in the evening. It was a rasping, nervous wind. The dust particles cut into man's skin and burned his eyes. Men working in the fields wore goggles and tied handkerchiefs around their noses to keep the dirt out. The valley land was deep and rich, but the foothills wore only a skin of topsoil no deeper than the grass roots. And the farther up the hills you went, the thinner grew the soil, with flints sticking through. Until the brush line, it was kind of dry, flinty gravel that reflected the hot sun blindingly. I have spoken of the rich years when the rainfall was plentiful, but there were dry years too, and they put terror on the valley. The water came in 30-year cycle. There would be 5 or 6 wet and wonderful years, when there might be 19 to 25 inches of rain, and the land would shout with grass. Then would come 6 or 7 pretty good years of 12 to 16 inches of rain, and then the dry years would come, and sometimes there would be only 7 or 8 inches of rain. The land dried up and the grasses headed out miserably, a few inches high, and great bare scabby places appeared in the valley. The live oaks got a crusty look and a sage brush with gray. The land cracked, and the springs dried up, and the cattle listlessly nibbled dry twigs. Then the farmers and the ranchers would be filled with disgust for the Salinas Valley. The cows would grow thin and sometimes starve to death. People would have to haul in water in barrels to their farms just for drinking. Some families would sell out for nearly nothing and move away, and it never failed that during the dry years, the people forgot about the rich years. And during the wet years, they lost all memory of the dry years. It was always that way. And that was the long Salinas Valley. Its history was like that of the rest of the state. First there were Indians, an inferior breed without energy, inventiveness, or culture. People that lived on grubs and grasshoppers and shellfish, too lazy to hunt or fish. They ate what they could pick up and planted nothing. They pounded bitter acorns for flour. Even their warfare was weary pantomime. Then the hard, dry Spaniards came exploring through, greedy and realistic, and their greed was for gold or God. They collected souls as they collected jewels. They gathered mountains and valleys, rivers and whole horizons, the way a man might now gain title to building lots. These tough, dried-up men moved restlessly up the coast and down. Some of them stayed on grants as large as principalities, given to them by Spanish kings who had not the faintest idea of the gift. These first owners lived in poor feudal settlements, and their cattle ranged freely and multiplied. Periodically, the owners killed the cattle for their hides and tallow, and left the meat to the vultures and coyotes. When the Spaniards came, they had to give everything they saw a name. This was the first duty of any good explorer, a duty and a privilege. You must name a thing before you can note it in your hand-drawn map. Of course, they were religious people, and the men who could read and write, who kept records and drew the maps, were the tough, untiring priests who traveled with soldiers. Thus, the first names of places were saints' names, or religious holidays celebrated at stopping places. There were many saints, but they are not inexhaustible, so that we find repetitions in the first namings. We have San Miguel, Saint Michael, San Ardo, San Bernardo, San Benito, San Lorenzo, San Carlos, San Francisquito, and then the holidays: Natividad, the Nativity, Nacimiento, the birth, Soledad, the solitude. But places were also named from the way the expedition fell at the time. Buena Esperanza, good hope. Buena Vista, because the view was beautiful. And Chualar, because it was pretty. The descriptive names followed. Paso de los Robles, because of the oak trees. Los Laureles, for the laurels. Dolorcitos, because of the reeds in the swamp. And Salinas, for the alkali, which was white as salt.